New videos every day.
Continuing with this idea of stigma. The ideas of Philip Zimbardo in his Lucifer Effect book, the recent book, are really good, and I want to share those. The idea basically is that, there's these three dynamics that lead to the ability to stigmatize somebody. One is dehumanization. The book by Sam Keen on the Faces of the Enemy is a really good example of how people that you're going to go war against, you demonize them and make them into evil, sadistic characters, But it's a similar thing when you dehumanize somebody by calling them schizophrenic or whatever, rather than really having empathy for what might be going on for them as a human being. It also de-individuates. You become an expert non-mentally ill or somebody who's superior, and you make that person into an illness as opposed to an individual, And finally, it diffuses responsibility. They're not responsibility because they're just sick, and you're not responsible, for really dealing with a relationship and dealing in community. It's like the doctor called them that. They must be that. You've got these processes that separate you from that individual. The responsibility diffusion thing is amazing. Zimbardo was famous for the prison experiment, where he set up people who were prisoners and guards, and they ended up in this mock prison in a basement with undergraduate psychology students, and they ended up having to call the experiment off because they became so abusive and mean-spirited, and the mock prisoners became so distressed. Well, the same dynamic has been repeated in studies around psychiatric dynamics. In 1973, there was a famous study in the Elgin State Hospital in Illinois. They took a bunch of staff, 29 specifically, and made them into patients, said, you're going to be patients for a while. So it was a mock experiment. And then they had 22 regular staff who were going to be their staff. And you see the same dynamic that Zimbardo saw in the prison, but in this case, the staff started becoming kind of disrespectful and abusive of the patients, mock patients, and the patients started feeling like mental patients and started breaking down and started feeling like they were incapacitated and losing their identity and saying all these things, right? And these were staff who were just put in the role of being patients. It was amazing. That same year, 1973, this guy David Rosenhan and 7 of his colleagues did an experiment where they got themselves checked into a psychiatric hospital. They went to the admissions and they just said one thing: I'm hearing voices, or I'm hearing noises like thud. That's all. They all got admitted, and from that point on, they acted perfectly normal, meaning themselves. They didn't mock up any more symptoms or problems. They just acted, and they were waiting to see how long will it take the hospital staff and the psychiatrist to see that these people are quote unquote normal, right? Well, it's amazing. How long do you think it took? Before they figured it out? Well, the answer was never. They never figured it out. Finally, the Rosenhan and these people, they finally got their colleagues and some lawyers involved and convinced, the psychiatrist to release the people, and they got released, But guess what it said in every one of their charts? This is amazing. I'll read the exact wording. Patient exhibits schizophrenia in remission. That's what's left in every one of their charts. They cannot get out of the view. It reminds me, as some of y'all know, and if you go to our endofshock.com website, you can see this, but Rocky Erickson's a pretty famous rock and roll musician. He's made a big comeback. He's a shock survivor. He's part of our coalition with the abolition of electroshock in Texas. He's now off all psychiatric drugs. He's now decided he never was mentally ill. He's playing in Europe this weekend. He's made this incredible comeback after a couple of decades of really being down after being beat up by psychiatry and drugs and shock and all that. Well, he actually was under the guardianship of his brother for several years. But now he's doing so great that they finally dissolved the guardianship. It's called rights restoration. Well, in that hearing for his rights restoration, the local mental health court judge who restored his rights But after that was done, and after he'd heard testimony about how great Rocky was doing, he didn't need the guardianship, he wasn't on drugs, etc., he had to say to Rocky, okay, I'm restoring your rights, but you know you're schizophrenic, right? And Rocky knew enough to not argue with the judge in that context, and so he said, yeah, whatever. And he said, you know you're schizophrenic, right? Yeah. Okay. You know you'll always be schizophrenic, right? You know there's no recovery from schizophrenia. You'll always be schizophrenic, right? He had to let him know that he will always be schizophrenic. And I suppose that's a claim to virtue because of the oppression that this guy's engaged in, where his business and livelihood is based on involuntarily committing and forcibly drugging people in the Austin, Travis County system over and over again. And he firmly believes that mental illness is biologically or genetically based, that you don't get over it, that you need your medicine. And he forces people to do that over and over again. And even though he had Rocky in front of him who was emerging from that, he could not let go of that belief system. In his mind, Rocky will always have that stigma. And these research studies show that there's just that's the power of the language, that's the power of the situation, and that's the danger of accepting this as a personal identity. And that's what we're going to talk about in a little deeper way. Because I mentioned the idea that he said stigma is something that deeply discredits somebody, right? An attribute that is deeply discrediting. But Goffman goes on, and he says, but it should be seen that a language of relationships, not attributes, is really needed. Do you get that? It's really about the relationship that the stigma points to and that the stigma determines. That's what's essential to understand. Thomas Zotz, the point is not that psychiatric diagnoses are meaningless, but that they may be and often are swung as semantic blackjacks. Cracking the subject's respectability and dignity destroys him just as effectively and often more so as cracking his skull. The difference is the man who wields a blackjack is recognized as a public menace, but one who wields a psychiatric diagnosis is not. See? It's the power dynamic. Or as Philip Zimbardo said, he said, I want to revise this little statement that you hear about sticks and stones may break my bones. The traditional way is, but words will never hurt me. He said, no, sticks and stones may break my bones, but bad names can kill me and good names can comfort me. And the bad name of schizophrenia can definitely kill you. There's research that's come out recently that shows that people labeled mentally ill die on average 25 years younger than people not labeled mentally ill. It'll kill you, largely because of the treatments, drugs and electroshock. I encourage you to read Goffman's book to really get into this, but the dynamic is that, and the subtitle of Goffman's book is Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. It's all about how once you get that stigma, you have to manage it. You have to either accept or reject the label. You can accept it and be a good patient, which means the doctors and your family might like you and you're good and you're taking your medicine and you're just a poor sick one, but you're a good patient. You're accepting that you're mentally ill, right? You don't want to be too bold, You don't want to put yourself down too much. You want to be a good patient, and then you're competent to make decisions at a minimal level. If you reject and deny your mental illness, then you're considered incompetent, and we can force you into treatment, commit you into the hospital, and force you to take your drugs. All based on how you accept and manage this spoiled identity that's given to you. And Goffman describes that. So the nature of a good adjustment becomes apparent. It's a patient who accepts their illness, who doesn't put you on the spot and make you uncomfortable by rejecting it, but at the same time doesn't put themselves down too much so they make you uncomfortable that way. That's a good adjustment. The way out is about diversity, empathy, human rights, recognizing your uniqueness, common sense, and being real clear about the language that's being used. The best definition of a normal person? Someone I don't know very well.